September 19th, 1944. A German Panther commander peers through fog so thick he can barely see 50 meters ahead. His vehicle is a genuine masterpiece, a long 75mm gun that can kill any American tank at 2,000 meters, double the effective range of anything the Americans can shoot back with, and over 3 inches of hardened steel sloped at 60 degrees, which roughly doubles its resistance to incoming rounds. The engineers who built this tank designed it specifically to dominate anything the Western Allies could field, and on paper, this should not even qualify as a battle. It should be a harvest. By sundown, his entire brigade will be gone, not beaten back, gone. Of the Panthers that rolled into that fog near the small French town of Arracourt, fewer than a third will still be running by nightfall. They will not be destroyed by a better tank, and they will not be destroyed by a miracle weapon. They will be destroyed by a system, a machine built, deliberately and methodically, out of the wreckage of one of the most humiliating American military failures of the 20th century. This isn't really a story about the Sherman tank. The Sherman was, by the honest engineering numbers, an inferior vehicle, and German commanders who held it in contempt were not wrong to. What follows is the forensic breakdown of how the United States Army went from the most embarrassingly defeated armored force on the Western Front to the most tactically effective one in 18 months, and why that transformation frightened Germany's elite panzer divisions far more than any single weapon ever could. Not because of what the Americans built, because of what they became. To understand what actually killed those Panthers in September 1944, you have to go back to a mountain pass in Tunisia in February 1943, and a defeat so complete it reshaped American military philosophy for the rest of the war. Because for exactly 6 weeks, the Germans had every reason to believe the Americans were amateurs, and they were right. Consider what the Wehrmacht had actually seen by that point. Poland conquered in 4 weeks. France, which had spent 2 decades building the Maginot Line and calling it the finest defensive system on earth, broken in 6. The British Expeditionary Force driven into the sea at Dunkirk. German spearheads at the gates of Moscow and deep into Egypt. Against every opponent it had faced, the Wehrmacht had prevailed, using a doctrine that was, by 1943, the most sophisticated military system on the planet. Blitzkrieg, built around speed, initiative, combined arms integration, and the deliberate targeting of an enemy's command structure rather than its front line. Paralyze the brain, and the body collapses on its own. German intelligence had already labeled the American military Britain's Italians, a phrase implying the U.S. would supply the same enthusiastic incompetence Italy had brought to the Axis cause. America had numbers and factories. What the Wehrmacht's analysts genuinely believed it lacked was the will to use either one effectively. On February 19, 1943, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps struck American positions at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, and what followed was less a battle than a confirmation of everything German intelligence had assumed. U.S. Second Corps attacked in parade ground formations, tanks advancing in neat V-shapes, light cavalry from a previous century, with no infantry coordination, no artillery integration, and almost no reconnaissance. The Corps commander, Major General Lloyd Friedendahl, had built his own headquarters in a ravine 70 miles behind the front, and communicated with his officers in a private code his own staff struggled to decrypt. He had never once visited the front line, and had no accurate picture of what was actually happening to his men. Rommel's panzers scattered the 1st Armored Division across 30 miles of desert within hours. In 5 days, 2nd Corps was driven back more than 50 miles, with American losses exceeding 6,500 men, 183 tanks destroyed, over 100 half-tracks lost, more than 200 artillery pieces abandoned, and roughly a fifth of the engaged force effectively ceasing to exist as a fighting unit. German commanders drew the obvious conclusion. America had wealth. It did not have soldiers. Here's the fact no German intelligence officer wrote in his report, and the one that explains everything that follows. The American army did not treat Kasserine as a defeat to be rationalized. It treated Kasserine as a data set. Within days, officers were filing after-action reports with a level of institutional honesty that was, by the standards of any army fighting that war, genuinely extraordinary. Not philosophical hand-wringing, but specific engagement-by-engagement documentation of exactly what had gone wrong, mapped through every critical decision point, all the way up the chain of command. And when the analysis was finished, the Army did something that sounds simple and is actually one of the hardest things any institution can do. It fired the people who had failed and promoted the people who understood why. Friedendahl was relieved on March 6, 1943. His replacement was George S. Patton, who had exactly 17 days to rebuild a shattered corps before the Germans attacked again. Same men, same equipment, same enemy. Friedendahl's own relief turned out to be the first data point in a much wider policy. Within the following year, the Army also removed or reassigned several of his direct subordinates who shared responsibility for the collapse, while officers who performed well under pressure, Terry Allen among them, were pushed upward regardless of how junior they had been before the campaign started. Seniority alone stopped being a reliable predictor of who held a given command, which was a genuinely unusual thing for any army, in any era, to sustain once real fighting started. On March 23, 1943, at El Guettar, Tunisia, the 10th Panzer Division, the very formation that had helped shatter American forces 6 weeks earlier, committed 50 of its 57 available tanks to a dawn attack down the El Guettar Valley, expecting the same result they'd gotten at Kasserine. They had no reason to expect anything different. What they found instead was a kill zone. Patton had placed the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion's M3 gun motor carriages in concealed positions along the valley walls, with artillery observers pre-registered on every German approach route and a minefield at the valley entrance stalling 8 German tanks in the opening minutes, bunching the vehicles behind them into a compressed formation with nowhere to maneuver. When American guns opened fire from 3 directions at once, German crews couldn't identify a single firing position, couldn't advance through the minefield, and couldn't retreat without exposing their thinner rear armor. The 10th Panzer Division lost more than 30 tanks that morning. The 601st alone claimed 37 kills among 52 armored vehicles destroyed, and it was the first time American forces had defeated an experienced German armored formation in open battle. Rommel himself noted afterward, in papers recovered post-war, that American commanders had absorbed the lessons of mobile warfare with remarkable speed. The man who had scattered this same army 6 weeks earlier was now watching it fight back with real precision. El Guettar was a preview, not the performance. What the Germans hadn't yet seen was what was being quietly rebuilt behind the improved tactics and the better leadership. The first German officer to encounter it running at full power would not survive the experience with his division intact. Here's how that rebuilding actually worked, in 4 separate parts, each one aimed at neutralizing a specific German advantage, and only truly lethal once all 4 were running together. Start with artillery, not because it was the most dramatic pillar, but because it was the foundation everything else stood on. The American Army perfected a technique called time-on-target fire, a concept the British had pioneered in North Africa using BBC radio time signals to synchronize distant batteries, which the Americans then industrialized and scaled well past anything the British had matched. Multiple batteries, positioned miles apart, firing at different trajectories and angles, coordinated so every shell from every gun landed on the target within the same few seconds, rather than in a rolling sequence. For a German infantryman caught in the open, there was no progressive buildup of sound to warn him and no interval to take cover in. The transition from silence to destruction had no middle stage. The response times were what actually broke German operational planning. A forward observer with frontline troops could call for battalion fire support and get it inside 3 minutes, divisional artillery inside 6, corps-level mass fires inside 9. Against a German response time of 30 minutes or more for the same request, meaning American guns were routinely 4 to 10 times faster at every level of command. For a doctrine built entirely around rapid concentration and rapid movement, that gap wasn't an inconvenience. It was a threat to the entire philosophical foundation of how the Wehrmacht fought. Every German plan that required a pause to regroup became, the moment it was executed, an American fire mission. The second pillar is what German commanders had genuinely no doctrinal counter for: air-ground integration. By the summer of 1944, the working partnership between Patton's Third Army and Brigadier General Otto Wayland's 19th Tactical Air Command had evolved into something no pre-war military theory had anticipated. Air liaison officers rode inside the lead tanks of armored columns with VHF radios, and when a column hit resistance, that officer could put P-47 Thunderbolts on the target within minutes. Pilots and tank crews training together closely enough that they invented improvised tactics in real time, faster than any manual could codify. German soldiers gave the P-47 a nickname, Jabo, short for Jag Bomber, and called the Normandy front the Jabo Rennbahn, the fighter-bomber racetrack. Any vehicle moving in daylight drew an attack within minutes, which meant German columns couldn't resupply, reinforcements couldn't reach the front, and reserves couldn't concentrate. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, commanding German forces in the West, wrote to Hitler directly that in the face of total Allied air superiority, there was no tactic left to compensate for its annihilating effect except withdrawal. Luftwaffe fighter chief Adolf Galland was blunt with interrogators after the war about why the Luftwaffe had been essentially absent from the skies over France. 2 years of strategic bombing and attritional air combat had left the German Air Force almost nothing to fight with by the summer of 1944. The sky belonged to the Allies. The ground was the only place Germany still had options, and those options were shrinking weekly. 2 pillars down: artillery you couldn't outrun, air power you couldn't hide from. The third pillar is the one German commanders found hardest to explain in their post-war interrogations, because it required admitting something they had dismissed about their enemy from the very beginning. The Americans were institutional learners, systematic, relentless learners at a speed and scale the Wehrmacht simply had no mechanism to match. After-action reviews and lessons learned documents circulated across entire commands. Officer replacement ran on demonstrated performance rather than seniority or political connection. Doctrine that wasn't working got discarded and replaced with doctrine derived from what had actually happened in combat, sometimes within days of the engagement itself. And no single moment demonstrates this pillar more vividly than a problem the American Army ran into in the Normandy hedgerows in June and July 1944. A problem its tactics, its air power, and its artillery could not solve on their own, and whose solution came not from a general or an engineer, but from a sergeant who had spent his pre-war career doing window dealers for a liquor distributor. Curtis Grubb Kuhlen III was 29 years old, a Cranford, New Jersey native, serving as a tanker with the New Jersey National Guard's 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, part of the 2nd Armored Division. Before the war, he had worked as a sales promotion assistant at Schenley Distillers in New York, window trimming, cost estimates, general clerking, a job description about as far from tank warfare as the Army could have found for him. What he was staring at that summer was the bocage, the ancient hedgerow country of Normandy, earthen banks 4 feet thick, topped with tangled vegetation up to 15 feet high, root systems running 3 to 12 feet deep, surrounding fields rarely wider than 300 feet. When Sherman tanks tried climbing over a hedgerow, they exposed their belly armor, the finished plating on the entire vehicle, directly to German anti-tank teams waiting on the other side, and the few obvious gaps through the hedges were already pre-registered for ambush. The Allied advance had slowed to roughly a mile a day at catastrophic cost. During a discussion about the problem, a soldier the histories remember only by the surname Roberts made an offhand suggestion. What if you put saw teeth on the front of the tank and cut through the hedge instead of climbing over it? Most of the men in the room laughed. Cullen didn't. He built a 4-pronged steel plow from scrap taken off captured German beach obstacles, the X-shaped Czech hedgehog barriers meant to rip open Allied landing craft on D-Day, and welded it to the bow of a Sherman. On July 14th, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley watched the demonstration in person. The tank accelerated to about 10 miles an hour, hit the hedgerow, and drove straight through it rather than over it, keeping its nose down and its belly armor never exposed. Bradley immediately grasped what he was looking at and ordered mass production. Ordnance units worked around the clock under camouflage netting, cutting up salvaged German beach obstacles and welding teeth onto tank hulls. Within 11 days, roughly 500 of what troops nicknamed Rhino devices had been built and installed, and 3 out of every 5 tanks in First Army carried the modification by the time Operation Cobra launched. Cullen was awarded the Legion of Merit, and years later Dwight Eisenhower mentioned him by name in one of his final speeches as president, recognition almost nobody else in this story ever received. Just 4 months after Cobra, Cullen lost his left foot to a landmine in the Hurtgen forest. A sergeant with a welding torch and a job title that involved decorating store windows had solved a problem that was paralyzing an entire army group, using steel the enemy itself had placed on the beaches specifically to stop the invasion in the first place. What Cobra did to the German army in Normandy connects directly to what happened 3 months later at Arracourt, so it's worth walking through briefly. At 9:38 on the morning of July 25, 1944, Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein commanded Panzer Lehr, not a reserve division or a hastily assembled brigade, but a formation built specifically from instructors, men chosen because they were the finest tank crews in Germany, pulled from training schools to demonstrate to the rest of the Wehrmacht how armored warfare was supposed to look. That morning, Panzer Lehr sat directly inside the impact zone of Operation Cobra, Bradley's plan to concentrate overwhelming force on a single corridor, roughly 7,000 yards wide west of St. Lo, and smash straight through it. The preceding bombardment was unlike anything the Western Front had yet witnessed. 1,500 heavy bombers, 60 groups of medium bombers, fighter bombers dropping tens of thousands of incendiary cluster munitions across roughly 12 square kilometers, more than 3,000 tons of high explosive delivered in 90 minutes into an area smaller than a mid-sized American city. Bayerlein was inside the box. His account of what followed remains one of the most harrowing primary sources of the entire European campaign. Bombers arriving as if on a conveyor belt, artillery positions obliterated, tanks overturned and buried, several of his men going clinically mad and running into the open until shell fragments cut them down. When Field Marshal von Kluge demanded the line be held, Bayerlein's reply, that his men were, in fact, still holding, lying silent in their foxholes because they were dead, has been paraphrased by military historians ever since as one of the bleakest lines any German commander wrote during the entire war. Over 70% of Panzer Lehr's effective strength was destroyed before a single American infantryman crossed the start line. By July 28th, the 4th Armored Division had taken Coutances. By July 31st, 6 days after Cobra began, it had captured Avranches and taken 20,000 prisoners. Patton took command of 3rd Army on August 1st and turned the breach into a flood. Of roughly 2,300 German tanks and assault guns committed to the Normandy campaign, only around 100 to 120 escaped across the Seine. The rest were destroyed, abandoned, or captured, and the German army in the West would never fully recover. Cobra had been a sledgehammer. Total air superiority, total surprise, 3,000 tons of bombs in 90 minutes. 6 weeks later, at Arracourt, the Americans had none of that. Fog grounded their air power. They were outnumbered in tanks and facing brand new Panthers, crewed by soldiers who had trained specifically on them. By conventional military logic, the Germans should have won. They didn't. And the margin, nearly 3-1 in America's favor, without the sledgehammer this time, is the clearest evidence available that what had actually changed since Kasserine ran deeper than any single advantage in equipment or air support. By early September 1944, Patton's Third Army had covered 300 miles across France in 3 weeks, and then its fuel simply ran out. Not from any German action, but because the advance had outrun even the Red Ball Express, the truck convoy running 24-hour shifts from the Normandy depots to the front, moving over 12,500 tons of supply a day at its peak, with roughly 6,000 trucks continuously in motion. Even that system couldn't keep pace with a breakout moving this fast. Tanks sat idle waiting for gasoline, and the pause gave Germany a window. General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army assembled 262 tanks and assault guns for a counteroffensive in Lorraine, including 2 brand-new panzer brigades, the 111th and 113th, fresh from the factory with Panthers whose crews had barely trained together, many of whom couldn't read a military map accurately and had conducted no reconnaissance of the ground they were about to fight over. What they had was faith that a Panther could answer anything a Sherman threw at it. Opposing them was Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division under Colonel Bruce Clark, vastly outnumbered, but having spent weeks in static defense around Arracourt, meaning every ridge line, every tree line, and every approach route was already scouted, mapped, and pre-registered for artillery. When German tanks emerged from the fog on September 19th, American guns were already trained on the approach routes, forcing German crews to search for targets while driving forward blind, while the Americans simply had to wait. In armored warfare, the side that fires first wins the overwhelming majority of engagements, and that morning it was the Americans firing first. Systematically, from positions German crews never once located. The engagement that most precisely captures what the Army had become didn't involve a Sherman tank at all. Captain William Dwight, liaison officer for the 37th Tank Battalion, sent First Lieutenant Edwin Leeper's 4-vehicle platoon of M18 Hellcat tank destroyers to establish a blocking position on a low rise called Hill 246, roughly 800 yards from the village of Rechicourt-le-Petit. The Hellcat carried almost no armor at all, thinner protection than an armored car, penetrable by a heavy machine gun, and made up for it with speed, the fastest tracked vehicle of the war, and a high-velocity 76mm gun that could kill a Panther from the flank or rear. The doctrine built around that trade-off came down to 3 actions: ambush, kill, relocate. Never trade blows head-on. Get the first shot from a position the enemy cannot identify. Kill. Move before anyone can return fire. Kill again from somewhere new. It was not built to survive being hit. It was built to avoid being hit at all, while killing whatever it was hunting. Sergeant Stacy, in the lead Hellcat on Hill 246, spotted a single German tank emerging from the tree line at the base of the slope and hit it with his first shot. A second target went down almost as fast. In the 5 minutes that followed, Leeper's platoon knocked out 5 tanks of the 113th Panzer Brigade for the loss of 1 M18. They held their position rather than withdrawing, and by the time the action wound down that day, Leeper's 4 vehicles had accounted for somewhere between 14 and 15 German tanks, against the loss of 3 of their own 4 Hellcats. A kill ratio that, from inside a Panther turret, must have felt close to physically impossible. Picture it for a moment. You're crewing the most feared medium tank on the Western Front. Your frontal armor has never once been penetrated at battle range. Your gun outranges anything a Sherman can answer with, and something is killing the tank to your left, then the tank to your right, from a direction you cannot identify, at a range where your armor doesn't matter at all because the round is striking your flank. You had 6 weeks of training. Nobody prepared you for this specific scenario. Across the entire war, the M18 Hellcat was credited with roughly 500 confirmed tank kills, at an overall kill-to-loss ratio near 2.5 to 1. Achieved not through superior armor or superior firepower, but through a doctrine that trained crews had genuinely internalized. Know exactly what you are, fight strictly on your own terms, and never let the enemy dictate the engagement. Arracourt acquired one more dimension the next day that no German planner could possibly have anticipated. On September 20th, something began attacking German tanks from the air. Not thunderbolts, still grounded by fog for most of the battle, but something smaller, slower, and by every rational measure incapable of killing a Panther at all. Major Charles Carpenter, an artillery observation pilot born and raised in Edgington, Illinois, and a former high school history teacher before the war, flew a Piper L-4 Grasshopper, an unarmored, fabric-covered, two-seat observation plane weighing under 1,000 pounds, which the Luftwaffe didn't bother shooting at as a matter of policy because it posed no conceivable threat to anything. Carpenter had modified his, inspired by most accounts by other L-4 pilots experimenting with the same idea, attaching first 2 and eventually 6 bazooka tubes to the wing struts, wired into the cockpit for electrical firing, and named the aircraft Rosie the Rocketer. When the fog lifted around noon on September 20th, and Carpenter spotted a company of German Panthers and armored cars advancing on Arracourt, he dove through active ground fire in a series of repeated passes, returned to base twice to reload, flew 3 sorties that afternoon, and fried at least 16 bazooka rockets total, credited by multiple ground witnesses with immobilizing several tanks and an armored car, and forcing the rest of the formation to pull back. He may be the only pilot in aviation history to become something close to a tank-killing ace in an unarmored fabric airplane. He was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma not long after the battle and told he had roughly 2 years left to live. He lived 22 more and died in 1966. By the end of September 1944, Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army had been broken. Of 262 tanks and assault guns committed to the offensive, only around 60 remained operational, roughly 90 completely destroyed, and well over 100 more damaged, broken down, or simply abandoned. Brand new Panzer brigades equipped with the finest tanks Germany could still produce, crewed by men who had received whatever training a collapsing wartime economy could still afford, had been annihilated in their first major engagement. A post-war analysis by the Army's Ballistic Research Laboratory, examining roughly 30 armor-on-armor engagements involving the 3rd and 4th Armored Divisions, found American formations achieving something close to a 3.5-to-1 kill ratio against the Panther, driven by experienced crews, sound tactics, seamless combined arms integration, and a first-shot advantage built on terrain knowledge and positioning discipline. There's a fourth factor underneath all of this, that German commanders, reading their own casualty reports that September, were only beginning to grasp fully. Not a tactical or doctrinal problem, but a mathematical one. The United States built roughly 49,200 M4 Shermans during the war. Germany built around 6,000 Panthers, 1,347 Tiger Is, and 489 Tiger IIs combined, a medium and heavy tank ratio favoring America by more than 6-to-1. At peak production, American factories were turning out over 2,000 Shermans a month. German Panther production peaked at 380 in July 1944 and never reached that figure again, while Tiger I production never exceeded 104 in any single month. Every month, America put more tanks into the field than Germany could build in 3. But the raw production numbers only tell part of the story. The deeper advantage was keeping tanks running once they were in the field. The Sherman was engineered from the drawing board for mass field maintenance. A full engine swap could be completed in hours by ordinary mechanics with standard tools. The Panther's transmission, by contrast, could take days to replace and often demanded specialized equipment simply unavailable at the front. Roughly 5% of Panthers broke down within their first 100 kilometers of road travel, and something close to 90% within 1,500 kilometers. German panzer divisions routinely operated below half their nominal armored strength, not from combat losses, but from mechanical attrition alone. I think that detail is the one most documentaries skip past too quickly. The Wehrmacht wasn't just losing a war of attrition on the battlefield. It was losing one to its own machinery before the fighting even started. The American 5-echelon maintenance system, by contrast, kept operational rates high even after devastating losses. The 3rd Armored Division entered Normandy with 232 Shermans, had 648 completely destroyed over the course of the campaign, and still returned another 700 repaired vehicles to service, something close to a 580% replacement cycle that German commanders, watching American units absorb losses and simply keep fighting, could not operationally understand. In the middle of all of this sat a man whose story ties every one of these pillars together. Staff Sergeant Lafayette Pool was born in Odom, Texas, on July 23, 1919. 5 minutes ahead of his twin brother. Rejected by the Navy over an eye injury, he reportedly memorized the eye chart well enough to pass the Army's physical instead. Studied engineering at Texas A&I before the war, and twice turned down a battlefield commission to officer rank because, in his own words, all he wanted was to have the best tank crew in the division. In England before D-Day, he volunteered for an exhibition boxing match against heavyweight champion Joe Louis. Landed a couple of real punches before Louis pulled him into a clinch and, by several accounts, quietly told him he was about to learn an important lesson, which Louis then delivered without a knockout, but thoroughly. Between June 27th and September 15th, 1944, Pool and his four-man crew, driver Wilbert "Baby" Richards, bow gunner Bert "Schoolboy" Close, gunner Willis "Groundhog" Aller, and loader Dell "Jailbird" Boggs, together through training and every mile since, took 3 successive Shermans, all named "In the Mood" after the Glenn Miller tune, and were credited with 12 confirmed tank kills and 258 other armored vehicles, self-propelled guns, and trucks. More than 1,000 German soldiers killed, and 250 prisoners taken, leading 21 major assaults along the way. Pool's war ended on September 15th near Münsterbusch, Germany, when a German round hit his third "In the Mood" as it tipped into a ditch and flipped. The explosion threw him from the commander's hatch, and shell fragments tore open his right leg, which was amputated 8 inches above the knee. He was 25 years old, was recommended for the Medal of Honor twice, and went home with the Distinguished Service Cross, the Legion of Merit, a Silver Star, and a Purple Heart. He opened a filling station in Corpus Christi, Texas, and lived until 1991. The character War Daddy in the 2014 film Fury reportedly drew, at least in part, on his story, though the filmmakers changed enough that most viewers watching Brad Pitt will never connect the character to the actual farm kid from Odom, who did something considerably more extraordinary than any screenplay bothered to capture. By December 1944, Germany launched its final gamble in the West, the Ardennes Offensive. Roughly 250,000 men and over 1,400 tanks aimed at splitting the Allied armies, capturing Antwerp, and forcing a negotiated peace. At a command conference on December 19th, Patton promised Eisenhower he could disengage 3 divisions from active combat on the Saar front, turn them 90 degrees, and attack north within 48 hours, a maneuver whose complexity, at that speed, in winter conditions, no army had ever attempted before. More than 133,000 vehicles reoriented on icy roads in blizzard weather. 62,000 tons of supplies shifted with them. The 4th Armored Division covered 150 miles in 19 hours. Men driving without sleep, tanks that broke down simply pushed off the road while the column kept moving. On December 26th, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding from his 6th Sherman named Thunderbolt, with just 20 operational tanks left under him, gave the order that entered American military memory more or less intact, that they were going in, and to let it roll. First Lieutenant Charles Boggess, commanding an M4A3E2 Jumbo Sherman, nicknamed Cobra King, led 9 tanks to the village of Assinoy under a barrage of over 2,000 artillery shells fired from 13 batteries in 8 minutes. Fire so intense it left the German defenders too stunned to react effectively. At 10 to 5 in the afternoon on December 26th, Boggess reached the Bastogne perimeter and exchanged a brief, almost absurdly understated greeting with the first American he encountered there, Second Lieutenant Dwayne Webster of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion. The 10-day siege was over. Cobra King survives today, restored, at the National Museum of the United States Army at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. German commanders who survived the war eventually said things in post-war memoirs and interrogations that they had never said while the war was still going on. Heinz Guderian, the father of German armored doctrine, told American interrogators in 1945 that Patton had run a genuinely good campaign, offering, from one tank specialist to another, something close to professional congratulations, assembling that Patton had acted essentially as Guderian himself would have. General Gunther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff of OB West, stated separately that the German High Command had come to regard Patton as the most aggressive panzer commander the Allies possessed. The man who designed the doctrine that conquered most of Europe was, by 1945, complementing the same army German intelligence had dismissed as Britain's Italians 2 years earlier. Historians have rightly noted that German post-war memoirs lean towards self-justification, emphasizing German tactical brilliance while blaming Hitler's interference and Allied material weight for the defeat, and that's a fair caution to keep in mind.
But the specific tactical observations in these accounts read as genuine. American combined arms effectiveness, artillery response speed, logistical depth, and air-ground coordination surprised commanders who had personally conquered most of Europe using the very doctrine that was now failing against them. Not because the Americans had better individual weapons, but because they had built a better system around inferior ones. The United States Army of February 1943 was routed at Kasserine Pass. The United States Army of September 1944 annihilated 2 elite panzer brigades at Arracourt at a kill ratio approaching 3-to-1, using tanks its own engineers openly acknowledged were individually inferior to what they were fighting. 18 months, largely the same basic equipment, the same training pipeline, radically different results. I don't think the difference was talent, and I don't think it was even primarily industrial output, though that mattered enormously. I think it was an institutional willingness, genuinely rare in any organization, in any era, to treat failure as information rather than as something to be managed or explained away. To promote the people who had actually learned something over the people who merely had seniority, and to trust a sergeant with a welding torch or a history teacher with 6 bazookas bolted to a wing strut as much as it trusted the generals with the theory degrees. Go back one more time to that Panther commander in the fog near Arracourt on the morning of September 19, 1944. He had the better tank by every specification sheet in existence. His gun could kill at twice the range. His armor was genuinely superior. He had been fighting since 1941. By any conventional measure, he should have been the more dangerous soldier in that valley. He was not fighting a better tank. He was fighting a system that had spent 18 months systematically eating its own failures and converting them into something he had no doctrine to counter. Artillery arriving before he'd finished hearing the first shot, Hellcats firing from positions he never located, air power that owned every daylight hour it wasn't grounded by weather, and somewhere above him in the gray September sky, a former history teacher in a fabric-covered airplane who had personally decided the rules of engagement were more of a suggestion than a rule. If a relative of yours served with the 4th Armored Division, the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, or anywhere else in this stretch of the war, Kasserine, Cobra, Arracourt, or the push to Bastogne, I'd genuinely like to hear whatever they told you about it in the comments, because these units, and the men who actually built this system one failure at a time, deserve to be remembered by name rather than folded into a single word like victory.